Minor warning, this is not a structured argument that I'm going to be making, so this is not a structured argument against free open source software or open source, but rather my own common thoughts on the topic, so there's a big warning at the start. So, to get my start, my main issue with all of the free open source and open source software, which I'm going to be talking about throughout this video, is it's the fundamental issue behind software being trivially copyable. Right? Now, I have loads of issues with free open source software and open source software, which I'll be referring to as FOSS and OSS. And I am trying to make a distinction between these two, obviously, but most of my critiques do apply to both, if that makes sense. Now, the problem is because of this trivial copyiness thing, it means software isn't property in the normal sense of the word. So trying to apply the same rules to it is where it starts to break down. And my issue is when you couple that with the first order thinking that many free open source software advocates do, it does lead to unsustainable practice and, again, single sources of dependency failure. Now, however, but the simplest argument, that, which I know is technically wrong, is due to what I'm already saying, that it is trivially copyable, and thus it's not really property in any traditional sense of that word. Software, at the end of the day, is very complicated and complex implementation of like an algorithm. So it means it's not physical property, and it's kind of closer to what we class intellectual property, which at the end of the day is closer to an honor system, right? Rather than say a property rights system, even though it has the term property in its phrase. So in a weird sense, it's like what, a subcategory of intellectual property, because it's not the algorithm or the idea itself which is precious, but the implementation of it, the software itself. The foundations of the assumptions like FOSS and OSS about the right to redistribute is blending a few different aspects together in my view. The license itself is an honor system applied to the software. But the question is that even applicable in the first place? There are a lot of oddities when it comes to like copyright and trademark law in general, as if you've ever tried to research it, which are mostly done due to practicality rather than based on any principles. One of my favorite examples of this are recipes cannot be copyrightable. And this is not from a principled aspect because there isn't any reason why they couldn't be. The reason is that recipes have been passed down around all over the place by numerous different people over the years. So the origins are really hard to trace, even harder to enforce. This is why many industries have like trade secrets to protect the place in industry. So letting people know your secrets means that those secrets are no more. And even legally, like secret recipes are classed as the same as like trade secrets. Now, this argument could also apply to like patents, but they're like, they are fundamentally in like the same ilk, and I really, really dislike software patents most of the time as well. Again, very few exceptions. But I'm not going to get into this topic right now. That's for a completely different day. Now, you could argue that letting people have more knowledge is a benefit to society, to use that phrase. But I think this is first order thinking personally. And the assumption that the truth will set you free is adding another assumption that everyone should know it in the first place. And again, I'm not making a pseudo-Gnostic argument here, by the way, but rather someone's secrets are best kept well secret. And it also makes sense from a business sense too, to not let your competitors know how to do things if you want some sort of technical advantage. But this is, again, still what I would say first order thinking. If you go to second order, which again is still not that deep, it means that people tend to rely on ideas rather than evolving and generating more. And it means more people just rely on the free things rather than trying to come up with other approaches. And to clarify what I mean by this first order thinking, it's thinking about the immediate results rather than the long-term, more complex and complicated results, which require thinking in higher orders. Now, to do an analogy, what I mean by this higher order thinking is it would be like a Taylor series. In this analogy, the first order is just like the linear approximation, the second is the quadratic, etc., etc. So as you add more terms, you get a more and more accurate approximation of the orders as you go along. But this gets closer to the actual function, so it gets better fitting. But again, it still has loads of limitations and flaws. And in the case of thinking, more and more orders might not be easy or even possible to think about a lot of the time. The other issue is that ideas themselves have virtually no cost to them, or even a negative cost, and as such, when something is free, people cannot rationally calculate the cost-benefit analysis of such ideas. It's assuming that the marketplace of ideas is even possible when a market requires a price mechanism to work. And a rational marketplace requires a way to rationally calculate costs from prices, as costs are determined from prices, not the other way around. There's a reason why, if you ever seen the XKCD comic 2347 meme exists, people will rely on something just because it's free and forget, and I'm using that term loosely, that everything has a cost to it. Look, I, as many of you clearly know, I do run an open source, but it's not a free and open source software project known as the Odin programming language. When I first did it, if there was a possibility of like selling a compound ideas, I probably would have done. But the expected price of a compiler of a language, of a new language, is now free. It makes that nigh impossible to do, obviously, to make any money from it. So you have to either rely on charity or companies that rely on the product to pay for support, which again, I'm always grateful of. So thank you so much. And again, I'm always grateful of not just that, but also the amount of bug reports that people give us, the pull requests, and just the general usage of Odin. Again, thank you. It is really surreal that I work for a company, Django Effects, that uses my language for all of their products, and I get paid to do it. Some of my time is spent working on the Odin compiler and the Odin core library, but a lot of it's actually just working on the products themselves. And that's what I made Odin for in the first place, a language I could actually program in to make things, a means to an end, not an end into itself. Now, there does seem to be a common feeling of guilt programmers have, that they should give their knowledge to the world freely. But why are they feeling guilty? Is that a correctly placed emotion? Is that even valid? And why should you give your knowledge and wisdom away for free just because you got it for free? I could also add, but I'm not going to make this argument, right, is that free open source software is forcing charity on others, which the act itself is not virtuous but vicious. But the problem is, it's the idea of forced charity in this kind of ideology. I'm going to use these phrases very loosely on purpose. Has a very specific conception of charity. And this is the view that of charity as in beer, rather than the more traditional one as in the virtue of friendship of man. Or if you want to go even more fancy with the traditional theological subset, it is the friendship of man for God. There you go. But a lot of charity is free, but a lot is not. You can still be beneficial to others whilst making a profit. There is nothing intrinsically wrong about making a profit itself, unless you're like a Marxist. But again, that's a different discussion for a different day. Again, I trivially argue that people who release their source code when you pay for it, when they don't have to, is still being charitable. Yes, it does still have monetary cost to it, but that doesn't mean it's not a form of charity. But the open source software and the free open source software as a practice encourages, but doesn't luckily force, by telling people ought to work for free and give their services for free. And to be very, very clear here, my position on the topic is far from a common one, I know. And I don't mean it is like a straw man by any stretch. There are many definitions of OSS and FOSS. But I'd argue most of them are idealistic forms, which on the whole, except in certain instances, don't bring forth the ideals that they set out. To use this common phrase you might have seen in cybernetics, is that the purpose of a system is what it does, or POSIWID. And there is no point claiming that the purpose of a system is to do what it constantly fails to do. Now, of course, you can hypothetically make money from OSS and FOSS, but that doesn't mean it is either possible, nor sustainable, or even desirable. And I know this from first-hand experience. I'm always grateful for all the donations received from the Odin programming language through people's act of charity. And all that money does go back into the development of Odin. However, it's not really sustainable, nor a maintainable model. And I'd argue has never been, nor could be. And for every purported exception to this rule, I try to argue that none of them are because of OSS or FOSS model itself, but purely because of the individual programmer, developer, etc. The OSS FOSS dream is that it's a dream. It doesn't really live up to its ideals. And for every hypothetical benefit it has, it should be stated that it's a hypothesis and not a theory. Theories require evidence to be classed as such. And most of these benefits and freedoms of like OSS and FOSS are, again, double-edged swords, which have huge attack vectors. Vectors for security, sustainability, maintainability, and redistribution. Most of the industry is just, again, based on this blind faith without any way to verify that trust. And regardless of what I'm trying to correctly or incorrectly way of defining OSS and FOSS, to your preferred definition, I will say the multi-ordered effects are rarely considered. Now, I'm going to bastardize Lysander Spooner here, but to bastardize a quote from him, this much is certain, that it has either authorized such a tech oligarchy as we have had, or been powerless to prevent it. In either case, it is unfit to exist. Now, one thing I would like to make point here is that ideals are not principles. And again, most of these things here, when you're thinking about like the GNU ideals, they call them principles, but they're ideals, right? The ideals of essential freedoms. And again, they're not principles in the slightest. And I'd argue they haven't even aided in anything in the long run either. So to list some of these GNU list things here, I'll put a list in the description below, so don't worry. But freedom 0, the foundation one as they class it as, is the freedom to run a program as you wish for any purpose. Firstly, that's assuming you can run the program in the first place. And it's also, the statement's kind of vague, but I won't get into that too much yet. The next one is freedom 1, which is the freedom to study how a program works and change it so it does your computing as you wish. That means access to the source code is a precondition to this. Now, personally, I think this is actually two freedoms combined together. The first is the access to the source code, and the second is the secrets that should not exist, i.e. secret source in general, however you want to spell source. And again, why should that be free as in beer in praxis? Why? I understand that the ideal here is not suggesting it ought to be free as in beer, but that is the end result. And I'd argue the vast majority of FOSS advocates would say paying for source, as in i.e. source available, is not open source. Then there's the freedom 2, obviously, which is the freedom to redistribute copies that can help others. Why? Why? Do we allow this for other forms of intellectual property? If software is intellectual property, why is it being treated as if it's different? I know I've made this argument already kind of thing, but our legal systems don't say this anywhere elsewhere, so it's bizarre to me, right? And then the other one is this freedom is probably the most egregious one on this list, in my opinion, because it's like, you're literally assuming that it now needs to be free as in beer. But again, people say it isn't, but carry on. And then there's the third freedom, which is the freedom to distribute copies of your modified versions to others. By doing this, you can give the whole community a chance to benefit from your changes. Access to the source code, again, is another precondition for this. But this is the problem, right? This viral nature of licenses like the GPL are fundamentally pernicious aspect of FOSS, not necessarily always open source in general, just the free open source movement. And it's this idea of forcing charity on others. Of course, you are free to not use the software. But if there's virtually no other options, you either have to write your own thing yourself, or you have the potential to have virtually no business model. But again, this point here is, in my opinion, just an extension of freedom 2. And it's not helping their case. But again, none of these are principles. Freedom 0, that is the foundational one. For the rest, isn't even foundational, in my opinion. It pretty much relies on time preference using like pre-made software versus homemade software, to use those kind of phrases. Software could be a service, but it could also, again, an implementation of an algorithm or idea. So of course, these ideals only apply to some FOSS advocates, obviously, and not necessarily any of the OSS advocates. But again, it's still a general perception of it, I'd argue. So to kind of conclude this very unstructured brain dump, and I kind of apologize, it is just a bit of a brain dump. I can understand why people, I mean myself, like kind of really annoyed about this. But look, to me, I don't think open source software, nor even the free open source software, has been a good thing for software overall. And I actually think it has been a huge acceleration towards why software has been getting worse over these years. So thank you for listening to this other little mini brain dump rant thing today. So thank you very much for tuning in, and stay tuned for the next one whenever that's going to be coming out. So goodbye.